The cold steel bars slammed shut, and for the first time in his life, Daniel Carter felt the crushing weight of finality. At 22, he had been sentenced to 15 years behind bars. The courtroom had been silent when the judge announced his fate, but in his mind, the words had echoed endlessly. 15 years. More than a decade stolen from him for one reckless night, one desperate decision that had spiraled out of control. The robbery hadn't even been well planned. He and two friends had stormed into a gas station, adrenaline fueling their every move. They had meant to take the cash and run, but panic changed everything. A clerk pressed an alarm. A gun went off. Daniel still wasn't sure whose. No one had died, but a man had been shot in the leg. That was enough to turn a petty crime into something much worse. Armed robbery. Assault with a deadly weapon. His friends had taken plea deals. Daniel, stubborn and convinced he could fight the system, had gone to trial and lost. Now, as the prison door locked behind him, he realized there was no fighting anymore. There was only surviving. Prison was a world of its own, governed by unwritten rules and unspoken threats. The first few months were a lesson in endurance. He learned to keep his head down, to avoid unnecessary eye contact, to never show weakness. The food was barely edible, the air thick with tension. Every night, he lay on his bunk, staring at the ceiling, wondering how many years would pass before he stopped feeling like he was drowning. The worst part wasn't the violence or the isolation, it was the waiting. The endless hours stretching before him, each one identical to the last. Time moved differently behind bars. Days turned into weeks, then months, then years, all blending into a monotonous cycle of repetition. He saw men come and go, some released, some transferred, some carried out in body bags. For a long time, Daniel felt nothing but regret. Not just for the crime itself, but for the life he had wasted. He had never been a great student, never thought about college or careers. He had grown up in a neighborhood where survival mattered more than success. His mother had worked 2 jobs just to keep the lights on. His father had disappeared before he was old enough to remember him. The streets had been his only guide, and they had led him here. It wasn't a sudden epiphany, but a slow, painful realization. One night, unable to sleep, he wandered into the prison library. The selection was sparse, yellowed paperbacks, outdated encyclopedias, legal guides thick with words he barely understood. But then, something caught his eye. A book, worn from use, its cover barely holding together, Long Walk to Freedom by Nelson Mandela. Daniel had heard the name before, but never knew the story. He took the book back to his cell and began reading under the dim glow of the overhead light. He read about Mandela's 27 years in prison, his resilience, his unwavering belief in something greater than himself. He read about a man who refused to let his circumstances define him. And for the first time in years, Daniel felt something other than regret. He felt possibility. He went back to the library the next day. And the next. And the next. He read everything he could get his hands on: history, philosophy, fiction, even textbooks. Books became his escape, his rebellion against the walls that confined him. But reading wasn't enough. He wanted to understand, to learn. One day, he met an older inmate who went by the name of Mr. Reynolds. He had been a college professor before a financial scandal landed him behind bars. Unlike most of the men in prison, he still carried himself like an academic. When Daniel asked him about a book on political theory, Reynolds raised an eyebrow. "You actually want to learn this stuff?" he asked, skeptical. Daniel nodded. "Yeah, I do." That was the beginning of his real education. Mr. Reynolds became Daniel's mentor, his first real teacher. He started with the basics: critical thinking, writing, history. He taught Daniel how to break down complex ideas, how to form arguments, how to analyze information rather than just absorb it. "You've got a sharp mind, Carter," he said one day after Daniel finished explaining a passage from the Republic. "You ever think about going to college?" Daniel laughed. "I'm a convicted felon. Who the hell would accept me?" Reynolds didn't smile. "People have done it before. You'd be surprised. It planted a seed. At first, the idea seemed ridiculous. But the more he thought about it, the more it lingered. He had wasted his first 22 years. Did that mean he had to waste the rest? He got his GED. Then, he enrolled in every prison education program available. When there weren't enough classes, he studied on his own. He wrote letters to colleges, asking for information on their programs. Most didn't respond. A few sent back polite rejections. But one day, a packet arrived from a professor at a community college who had heard about his story. Inside was a note. Keep learning. Your past doesn't define you. Daniel doubled down. He worked harder than he ever had in his life. He spent every waking moment studying, writing essays, preparing for something he wasn't even sure was possible. And then, one of his professors suggested something absurd. You should apply to Harvard. Daniel almost laughed. Harvard? The Ivy League? The school where presidents and billionaires studied? He was a felon. A convict. A man who had spent the last decade behind bars. But his professor insisted. What do you have to lose? He applied. He poured his entire soul into his application essays, his past, his mistakes, his transformation. He wrote about nights spent in solitary confinement, about the books that had saved him, about the moment he realized that knowledge was the only true escape. He mailed the application and tried to forget about it. The odds were impossible. Months passed. Then, one afternoon, he received a letter. It was thin, too thin, he thought. A rejection. He opened it with shaking hands, ready to see the words, "We regret to inform you." Instead, he read, "Congratulations, Mr. Carter. Welcome to Harvard University." For a long time, he couldn't breathe. He read the words over and over again, sure he had misunderstood. But it was real. Against every odd, against every expectation, he had done it. Walking onto Harvard's campus for the first time was like stepping into another universe. The grand halls, the manicured lawns, the students who had spent their entire lives preparing for this moment, it was overwhelming. He was older than most of them, a decade behind in experience. He carried scars, both visible and invisible, that none of them could understand. And yet, he belonged. The first few months were hard. There were whispers, glances, students who looked at him with curiosity or fear when they learned his story. Professors who hesitated, unsure if he deserved to be there. But there were also those who welcomed him, professors who saw his hunger for knowledge, students who admired his resilience. He struggled, but he never quit. He wrote papers on criminal justice reform, on philosophy, on the failures of the prison system. He spoke in classes about his experiences, challenging perspectives, forcing conversations most students had never considered. And one day, he stood in front of a packed auditorium, delivering a speech on second chances. "My name is Daniel Carter," he said, his voice steady. "I am a former inmate. A convicted felon. A man who once believed his future ended in a prison cell. But I stand before you today as a student of Harvard University. Because redemption is real. Because education is power. Because no one is beyond saving." When he finished, the room erupted into applause. For the first time in his life, Daniel Carter felt free. If you found this story inspiring, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories that matter. Your support helps us share more real-life journeys of resilience, redemption, and transformation. Let us know your thoughts in the comments. We would love to hear from you.